The Diary of Anne Frank by Frances Goodrich and Albert Hackett. Act 1, Scene 5. It is the first night of the Hanukkah celebration. Mr. Frank is standing at the head of the table on which is the menorah. He lights the shamos, or servant candle, and holds it as he says a blessing. Seated listening is all the family, dressed in their best. The men wear hats. Peter wears his cap. Mr. Frank, reading from a prayer book. Praise be thou, O Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who has sanctified us with thy commandments and bidden us kindle the Hanukkah lights. Praise be thou, O Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who has wrought wondrous deliverances for our fathers in days of old. Praise be thou, O Lord our God, ruler of the universe, that thou hast given us life and sustenance and brought us to this happy season. Mr. Frank lights the one candle of the menorah as he continues. We kindle this Hanukkah light to celebrate the great and wonderful deeds wrought through the zeal with which God filled the hearts of the heroic Maccabees 2,000 years ago. They fought against indifference, against tyranny and oppression, and they restored our temple to us. May these lights remind us that we should ever look to God, whence cometh our help. Amen. All. Amen. Mr. Frank hands Mrs. Frank the prayer book. Mrs. Frank, reading. I lift up mine eyes unto the mountains, from whence cometh my help. My help cometh from the Lord, who made heaven and earth. He will not suffer thy foot to be moved. He that keepeth thee will not slumber. He that keepeth Israel doth neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord is thy keeper. The Lord is thy shade upon thy right hand. The sun shall not smite thee by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord shall keep thee from all evil. He shall keep thy soul. The Lord shall guard thy going out and thy coming in from this time forth and forevermore. Amen. All. Amen. Mrs. Frank puts down the prayer book and goes to get the food and wine. Margot helps her. Mr. Frank takes the men's hats and puts them aside. Dussel, rising. That was very moving. Anne, pulling him back. It isn't over yet. Mrs. Van Dam. Sit down, sit down. Anne, there's a lot more. Songs and presents. Dussel, presents? Mrs. Frank. Not this year, unfortunately. Mrs. Van Dam. But always on Hanukkah, everyone gives presents. Everyone. Dussel. Like our St. Nicholas Day? There's a lot of chorus of no's from the group. Mrs. Van Dam. No, not like St. Nicholas. What kind of a Jew are you that you don't know Hanukkah? Mrs. Frank, as she brings the food. I remember particularly the candles. First one, as we have tonight. Then the second night you light 2 candles, the next night 3, and so on until you have 8 candles burning. When there are 8 candles, it is truly beautiful. Mrs. Van Dam. Ah, and the potato pancakes. Mr. Van Dam. Don't talk about them. Mrs. Van Dam. I make the best latkes you ever tasted. Mrs. Frank. Invite us all next year, in your own home. Mr. Frank. God willing. Mrs. Van Dam. God willing. Margot. What I remember best is the presents we used to get when we were little. 8 days of presents, and each day they got better and better. Mrs. Frank, sitting down. We are all here alive. That is present enough. Anne. No, it isn't. I've got something. She rushes into her room, hurriedly puts on a little hat improvised from a lampshade, grabs a satchel bulgy with parcels, and comes running back. Mrs. Frank. What is it? Anne. Presents. Mrs. Van Dam. Presents? Dussel. Look. Mr. Van Dam. What's she got on her head? Peter. A lampshade. Anne. She picks out one at random. This is for Margot. She hands it to Margot, pulling her to her feet. Read it out loud. Margot, reading. You have never lost your temper. You never will, I fear. You are so good, but if you should, put all your crosswords here. She tears open the package. A new crossword puzzle book. Where did you get it? Anne. It isn't new. It's one that you've done, but I rubbed it all out, and if you wait a little and forget, you can do it all over again. Margot, sitting. It's wonderful, Anne. Thank you. You'd never know it wasn't you. From outside we hear the sound of a streetcar passing. Anne with another gift. Mrs. Van Dam. Mrs. Van Dam taking it. This is awful. I haven't anything for anyone. I never thought, Mr. Frank, this was all Anne's idea. Mrs. Van Daan holding up a bottle. What is it? Anne, it's hair shampoo. I took all the odds and ends of soap and mixed them with the last of my toilet water. Mrs. Van Daan. Oh, Annika. Anne, I wanted to write a poem for all of them, but I didn't have time. Offering a large box to Mr. Van Dam. Yours, Mr. Van Dam, is really something you want more than anything, as she waits for him to open it. Look, cigarettes. Mr. Van Dam, cigarettes? Anne, 2 of them. Pym found some old pipe tobacco in the pocket lining of his coat, and we made them, or rather Pym did. Mrs. Van Dam, let me see. Well, look at that. Light it, Putty, light it. Mr. Van Dam hesitates. Anne, it's tobacco, really it is. There's a little fluff in it, but not much. Everyone watches intently as Mr. Van Dam cautiously lights it. The cigarette flares up. Everyone laughs. Peter, it works. Mrs. Van Dam, look at him. Mr. Van Dam spluttering. Thank you, Anne, thank you. Anne rushes back to her satchel for another present. Anne, handing her mother a piece of paper. For Mother, Hanukkah greeting. She pulls her mother to her feet. Mrs. Frank, she reads, Here's an IOU that I promise to pay. 10 hours of doing whatever you say. Signed, Anne Frank. Mrs. Frank, touched, takes Anne in her arms, holding her close. Dussel to Anne. 10 hours of doing what you're told? Anything you're told? Anne, that's right. Dussel, you wouldn't want to sell that, Mrs. Frank. Mrs. Frank, never. This is the most precious gift I've ever had. She sits, showing her present to the others. Anne hurries back to the satchel and pulls out a scarf, the scarf that Mr. Frank found in the first scene. Anne, offering it to her father. For Pym. Mr. Frank, Annika, I wasn't supposed to have a present. He takes it, unfolding it and showing it to the others. Anne, it's a muffler to put round your neck, like an ascot, you know. I made it myself out of odds and ends. I knitted it in the dark each night after I'd gone to bed. I'm afraid it looks better in the dark. Mr. Frank, putting it on. It's fine. It fits me perfectly. Thank you, Annele. Anne hands Peter a ball of paper with a string attached to it. Anne, that's for Mooshie. Peter, rising to bow. On behalf of Mooshie, I thank you. Anne, hesitant, handing him a gift. And this is yours, from Mrs. Quack Quack, as he holds it gingerly in his hand. Well, open it. Aren't you going to open it? Peter, I'm scared to. I know something's going to jump out and hit me. Anne, no, it's nothing like that, really. Mrs. Van Dam, as he's opening it. What is it, Peter? Go on, show it. Anne, excitedly. It's a safety razor. Dussel, a what? Anne, a razor. Mrs. Van Dam, looking at it. You didn't make that out of odds and ends. Anne, to Peter, Miep got it for me. It's not new, it's second hand, but you really do need a razor now. Dussel, for what? Anne, look on his upper lip. You can see the beginning of a mustache. Dussel, he wants to get rid of that? Put a little milk on it and let the cat lick it off. Peter, starting for his room. Think you're funny, don't you? Dussel, look, he can't wait. He's going in to try it. Peter, I'm going in to give Mooshie his present. He goes into his room, slamming the door behind him. Mr. Van Dam, disgustedly. Mooshie, Mooshie, Mooshie. In the distance we hear a dog persistently barking. Anne brings a gift to Dussel. Anne, and last but never least, my roommate, Mr. Dussel. Dussel, for me? You have something for me? He opens the small box she gives him. Anne, I made them myself. Dussel, puzzled. Capsules. 2 capsules? Anne, they're earplugs. Dussel, earplugs? Anne, to put in your ears so you won't hear me when I thrash around at night. I saw them advertised in a magazine. They're not real ones. I made them out of cotton and candle wax. Try them. See if they don't work. See if you can't hear me talk. Dussel, putting them in his ears. Wait now till I get them in, so... Anne, are you ready? Dussel, huh? Anne, are you ready? Dussel, oh, they've got inside. I can't get them out. They laugh as Mr. Dussel jumps about, trying to shake the plugs out of his ears. Finally, he gets them out, putting them away. Thank you, Anne, thank you. Together, Mr. Van Dam. A real Hanukkah, Mrs. Van Dam. Wasn't it cute of her? Mrs. Frank, I don't know when she did it. Margot, I love my present. Anne sitting at the table. And now let's have the song, Father, please. To Dussel, have you heard the Hanukkah song, Mr. Dussel? The song is the whole thing. She sings, "O Hanukkah, the sweet celebration." Mr. Frank quieting her. I'm afraid, Anne, we shouldn't sing that song tonight. To Dussel, it's a song of jubilation, of rejoicing. One is apt to become too enthusiastic. Anne, oh, please, please, let's sing the song. I promise not to shout. Mr. Frank, very well, but quietly now. I'll keep an eye on you, and when... As Anne starts to sing, she is interrupted by Dussel, who is snorting and wheezing. Dussel, pointing to Peter. You! Peter is coming from his bedroom, ostentatiously holding a bulge in his coat as if he were holding his cat and dangling Anne's present before it. How many times I told you, out! Mr. Van Dam going to Peter. What's the matter with you? Haven't you any sense? Get that cat out of here. Peter, innocently. Cat? Mr. Van Dam, you heard me. Get it out of here. Peter, I have no cat. Delighted with his joke, he opens his coat and pulls out a bath towel. The group at the table laugh, enjoying the joke. Dussel, still wheezing. It doesn't need to be the cat. His clothes are enough when he comes out of that room. Mr. Van Dam, don't worry, you won't be bothered any more. We're getting rid of it. Dussel, at last you listen to me. He goes off into his bedroom. Mr. Van Dam calling after him. I'm not doing it for you. That's all in your mind, all of it. He starts back to his place at the table. I'm doing it because I'm sick of seeing that cat eat all our food. Peter, that's not true. I only give him bones, scraps. Mr. Van Dam, don't tell me. He gets fatter every day. Damn cat looks better than any of us. Out he goes tonight. Peter, no. Anne, Mr. Van Dam, you can't do that. That's Peter's cat. Peter loves that cat. Mrs. Frank quietly. Anne. Peter to Mr. Van Dam. If he goes, I go. Mr. Van Dam. Go. Mrs. Van Dam. You're not going, and that cat's not going. Now, please, this is Hanukkah. This is a time to celebrate. What's the matter with all of you? Come on, Anne, let's have the song. Anne singing. O Hanukkah, the sweet celebration. Mr. Frank rising. I think we should first blow out the candle. Then we'll have something for tomorrow night. Margot, but Father, you're supposed to let it burn itself out. Mr. Frank, I'm sure that God understands shortages. Before blowing it out, praised be thou, O Lord our God, who hast sustained us and permitted us to celebrate this joyous festival. He is about to blow out the candle when suddenly there's a crash of something falling below. They all freeze in horror, motionless. For a few seconds there is complete silence. Mr. Frank slips off his shoes. The others noiselessly follow his example. Mr. Frank turns out a light near him. He motions to Peter to turn off the center lamp. Peter tries to reach it, realizes he cannot, and gets up on a chair. Just as he is touching the lamp, he loses his balance. The chair goes out from under him. He falls. The iron lampshade crashes to the floor. There is a sound of feet below, running down the stairs. Mr. Van Dam, under his breath, oh! The only light left comes from the Hanukkah candle. Dussel comes from his room. Mr. Frank creeps over to the stairwell and stands listening. The dog is heard barking excitedly. Do you hear anything? Mr. Frank in a whisper. No, I think they've gone. Mrs. Van Dam. It's the Green Police. They've found us. Mr. Frank. If they had, they wouldn't have left. They'd be up here by now. Mrs. Van Dam. I know it's the Green Police. They've gone to get help, that's all. They'll be back. Mrs. Van Dam. Or it may have been the Gestapo looking for papers. Mr. Frank interrupting. Or a thief looking for money. Mrs. Van Dam. We've got to do something. Quick, before they come back. Mr. Van Dam. There isn't anything to do. Just wait. Mr. Frank holds up his hand for them to be quiet. He is listening intently. There is complete silence as they all strain to hear any sounds from below. Suddenly Anne begins to sway. With a low cry, she falls to the floor in a faint. Mrs. Frank goes to her quickly, sitting beside her on the floor and taking her in her arms. Mrs. Frank, get some water, please. Get some water. Margot starts for the sink. Mr. Van Dam grabbing Margot. No, no. No one's going to run water. Mr. Frank, if they've found us, they've found us. Get the water. Margot starts again for the sink. Mr. Frank getting a flashlight. I'm going down. Margot rushes to him, clinging to him. Anne struggles to consciousness. Margot, no, Father, no, there may be someone there waiting. It may be a trap. Mr. Frank, this is Saturday. There is no way for us to know what has happened until Meep or Mr. Kraler comes on Monday morning. We cannot live with this uncertainty. Margot, don't go, Father. Mrs. Frank, hush, darling, hush. Mr. Frank slips quietly out, down the steps and out through the door below. Margot, stay close to me. Margot goes to her mother. Mr. Van Dam, shush, shush. Mrs. Frank whispers to Margot to get the water. Margot goes for it. Mrs. Van Dam, Pooty, where's our money? Get our money. I hear you can buy the green police off. So much ahead. Go upstairs quick. Get the money. Mr. Van Dam, keep still. Mrs. Van Dam kneeling before him pleading. Do you want to be dragged off to a concentration camp? Are you going to stand there and wait for them to come up and get you? Do something, I tell you. Mr. Van Dam pushing her aside. Will you keep still? He goes over to the stairwell to listen. Peter goes to his mother, helping her up onto the sofa. There is a second of silence. Then Anne can stand it no longer. Anne, someone go after Father. Make Father come back. Peter starting for the door. I'll go. Mr. Van Dam, haven't you done enough? He pushes Peter roughly away. In his anger against his father, Peter grabs a chair as if to hit him with it, then puts it down, burying his face in his hands. Mrs. Frank begins to pray softly. Anne, please, please, Mr. Van Dam, get Father. Mr. Van Dam, quiet, quiet. Anne is shocked into silence. Mrs. Frank pulls her closer, holding her protectively in her arms. Mrs. Frank softly praying. I lift up mine eyes unto the mountains, from whence cometh my help. My help cometh from the Lord who made heaven and earth. He will not suffer thy foot to be moved. He that keepeth thee will not slumber. She stops as she hears someone coming. They all watch the door tensely. Mr. Frank comes in. Anne rushes to him, holding him tight. Mr. Frank, it was a thief. That noise must have scared him away. Mrs. Van Dam, thank goodness. Mr. Frank, he took the cash box and the radio. He ran away in such a hurry that he didn't stop to shut the street door. It was swinging wide open. A breath of relief sweeps over them. I think it would be good to have some light. Margot, are you sure it's all right? Mr. Frank, the danger has passed. Margot goes to light the small lamp. Don't be so terrified, Anne. We're safe. Dussel, who says the danger has passed? Don't you realize we are in greater danger than ever? Mr. Frank, Mr. Dussel, will you be still? Mr. Frank takes Anne back to the table, making her sit down with him, trying to calm her. Dussel, pointing to Peter, thanks to this clumsy fool, there's someone now knows we're up here. Someone now knows we're up here hiding. Mrs. Van Dam, going to Dussel. Someone knows we're here, yes, but who is that someone? A thief? A thief? You think a thief is going to go to the Green Police and say, I was robbing a place the other night and I heard a noise over my head? You think a thief is going to do that? Dussel, yes, I think he will. Mrs. Van Dam hysterically, you're crazy. She stumbles back to her seat at the table. Peter follows protectively, pushing Dussel aside. Dussel, I think some day he'll be caught, and then he'll make a bargain with the Green Police. If they let him off, he'll tell them where some Jews are hiding. He goes off to the bedroom. There's a second of appalled silence. Mr. Van Dam, he's right. Anne, Father, let's get out of here. We can't stay here now. Let's go. Mr. Van Dam, go where? Mrs. Frank, sinking into her chair at the table. Yes, where? Mr. Frank, rising to them all. Have we lost all faith, all courage? A moment ago we thought they'd come for us. We were sure it was the end, but it wasn't the end. We're alive, safe. Mr. Van Dam goes to the table and sits. Mr. Frank prays. We thank thee, O Lord our God, that in thy infinite mercy thou hast again seen fit to spare us. He blows out the candle, then turns to Anne. Come on, Anne, the song. Let's have the song. He starts to sing. Anne finally starts falteringly to sing. as Mr. Frank urges her on. Her voice is hardly audible at first. Anne singing, "O Hanukkah, the sweet celebration." As she goes on singing, the others gradually join in, their voices still shaking with fear. Mrs. Van Dam sobs as she sings. The group. Around the feast we gather in complete jubilation. Happiest of seasons now is here. Many are the reasons for good cheer. Dussel comes from the bedroom. He comes over to the table, standing beside Margot, listening to them as they sing. Together we'll weather whatever tomorrow may bring. As they sing on with growing courage, the lights start to dim. So hear us rejoicing and merrily voicing the Hanukkah song that we sing. The lights are out, the curtains start slowly to fall. Hear us rejoicing and merrily voicing the Hanukkah song that we sing. They are all still singing as the curtain falls.